Okay, good morning. Welcome to this session on EAL learners. And I am so pleased to be joined by Joanna Kolota, who is one of the most prolific figures in EAL at the moment. But I won't spend too much time introducing you. Give you a chance to introduce yourself. Who are you? How did you come into your work into EAL?
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to you. So I currently work as a curriculum leader for multilingual learners at Trinity Academy Leeds. And my role encompasses building up, scaling up, and providing the best provision for multilingual learners in my school. In my current school, we have 70% students who are multilingual learners, but we are based in one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse neighborhoods in England, definitely in the north. And I've worked in the English language teaching field for the last 15 years. I've worked in all sorts of settings. I've worked in primary schools, secondary schools, but I also worked with adults, and I delivered ESOL classes to students 16 plus. Additionally, I also worked with adults in tertiary education. So I delivered courses preparing students for the undergraduate and postgraduate courses at one of the universities in England. So I've worked with really young learners through primary, secondary, 16 plus, and adults as well. And I've worked in Poland and in England. So I've worked with students who are learning English as a foreign language, but my main area of expertise and experience is working with students who are learning English as an additional language. And there is quite a distinctiveness and a lot of features that sort of make that field a little bit different than any other English learning and English teaching.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm struck by a few things, which is, first of all, you talked about multilingual learners. And obviously terminology, I think, really matters. So can we clarify it? So what terminology should we be using, or is the distinction too great and we need to have, separate categories?
I've actually been talking recently to one of my colleagues about the many terms and initialisms and acronyms that we use in the field. And I pointed out that it's a good thing because things are changing and evolving for the better. But at the same time, I think with so many different words and terms, that there is a slight confusion. Who are these students? How do we support them? When we talk about EAL, are we talking about multilingual or plurilingual students or emergent bilinguals? And similarly, when it comes to reading research, I've noticed that researchers use many different words as well. And then it kind of clouds and confuses the reader. Who are the students? So the official definition that is used in England is EAL, and English as an additional language are students who at some point have been exposed to language other than English. Now, this is a very vague definition, and it doesn't specify necessarily what it means being exposed to English. It could mean that some students are fluent in a particular language, but at the same time, it could mean that maybe grandparents spent a few months with that child and there's that exposure. And when we start digging deeper, we might also focus on what actually language is, because it's not only the act of communicating and using words, but it's everything else, including the traditions and culture. So there are loads of links that we can explore.
Yeah.
Now, in my school, from the very beginning, we started to use the term multilingual learners. And I think it is sort of an umbrella term for all students who speak another language, who have connection to other language, however tenuous. And it also frames a sort of more asset-based approach towards those students. Because very often when, for example, there is a new student joining our school and we say this student is a student with EAL, not many, but a lot of people, I would say, assume, oh, new to English. They know very little English. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be very challenging for me to prepare resources. Whereas multilingual learners when we use that phrase, it doesn't, it talks about all languages, all the linguistic repertoire that the students have access to. And ideally, it wouldn't create a hierarchy of languages, because all languages are important. And I know we are in England, the main language used in school is English. However, we have to acknowledge that students' sort of affinity to other languages might be greater than actually to English. And
Yeah.
many of those students are multilingual learners. They speak 2 or 3 languages, and many of them are literate in those languages. And we have to acknowledge that it's not just us saying, well, now it's English only. It's
Mm.
use whatever language you have, use whatever skills you have in those languages to
Yeah.
help you get where you're going, essentially, in your academic journey. And there's a lot of research that supports the claim that actually developing your first language
Yeah.
helps you with any other
Yeah.
languages.
I
So
mean, the growing up, I would have been classified as having English as an additional language. My first language was Gujarati. It was a very odd mix because it was also mixed in with Swahili because my parents were East African and Asian.
Mhm.
Um, and I learned English as a second language, but it was my predominant language. I think it would have been much more useful if actually somebody had said you are multilingual, you know,
Absolutely.
um, and actually a kind of a kinder term in some ways, um, a more generous term, a more accepting term. So I really like that. Um,
Absolutely. When we
cool.
have new students joining my school, I think one of the first sentences I usually say is, "We are a multilingual school."
Yeah.
I know we are in England, I know we use English, but we are very much multilingual. And we welcome all languages. We have to remember that languages in our brain are not sort of put in compartments. They are all there at the same time, and we leverage development of languages using everything else that the students have. And I think it's acknowledging and making sure that it's not only we let them use the language, but we enable them to use those languages within the school, whatever it means, whether it helps them access the lesson or develop the languages later on, such as, for example, entering students for the GCSE exams in their first languages. And we also run meetings with parents, and many of them, I think every single parent, is proud for their for their children to carry on the language and carry on learning, and they are extremely supportive of us as a school, helping the children develop that language, and that sort of agency developing in parents is absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, there's so much to take in here. But I think, when people listening will want to know kind of what the foundations are. So rather than it having, I think traditionally it's always been like EAL department over here. What's a school to do to create good foundations for EAL teaching, multilingual teaching?
I think one thing to remember is, of course, that we are shifting and changing the terminology, but simply by simply calling students multilingual learners, they're not necessarily going to achieve great results if we're not going to put some work into it. So
Yeah.
terminology is obviously important, but we still have to acknowledge that there's still the English language support that needs to be offered to them. And you've mentioned EAL departments, which I know different schools operate differently, and it's based on the context they found themselves in. Some schools, like my school, have got a very large population, a large cohort of multilingual learners. Therefore, you would expect that the provision we provide might be slightly different to a school where there are a few students who join, maybe mid-year, 5 students, 6. We have about 30 students who join us every single year. So we need to be ready. We need to make sure that we provide the best possible provision for them. And having an English department, English as an additional language department, is great. Obviously, they are extremely important, but I always stress that you might have the most wonderful English as an additional language department. However, if you don't do something as a whole school, then their work is not going to be as effective. And I always stress that supporting multilingual learners is every single person's job.
Mm-hmm.
And there is the phrase that we often use, that every teacher is a language teacher. I would extend it and say that every teacher needs to be an effective language teacher. And again, it goes back to your school. It might look different in your school if you have got advanced bilingual learners, as
Yeah,
opposed to a school that has suddenly seen a lot of students who are new to English or at the early stages of English language acquisition. And you have to be very agile and flexible, very responsive to the students in front of you, but also you need to be ensure that you support teachers within your context.
yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about the term immersion, the idea of immersion, placing EAL students in immersion lessons used to be quite unfashionable, but actually at my last school we had something called the welcome group. Our turnover of students was very high. We had lots of new arrivals who often didn't have very advanced English at all, very basic English, and needed that space. So is it still a dirty word, this idea of immersion and supporting students to get on their feet?
I always say we have to avoid dichotomies, that it's either this or
Yeah, yeah,
this end or this end. Ideally, I think our default position would be all students, regardless of their cultural linguistic background, regardless of their previous education, are in mainstream lessons.
yeah. Okay.
This is the ideal, but we have to look at individual cases.
Mm,
We have to look at each student individually, but also we have to ensure that if students are to be in mainstream lessons, that the teachers are knowledgeable enough and experienced enough and skilled enough at supporting those students. Because otherwise, what we really do by trying to include them so much
mm.
and placing them in mainstream lessons without the right support, we actually exclude them.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's
And
sort of,
that's worse in some
and
ways,
that's worse. Yes,
stressful for everybody involved. And I was thinking about how those students we selected went into welcome group, but they were tested, it was a kind of language proficiency. And it was really those who didn't speak English at all who went into those groups, and they were moved into mainstream as soon as they had that ability to cope. But we would never have thrown them in if they couldn't do it. So you
absolutely.
talk about effective teachers and you talk about skilled teachers. And so what elements of teaching EAL students should teachers be well versed in? How much work do they have to do?
I'll just go back and just finish my thought
Yeah,
about
sure.
the creating sort of extra support classes or language support classes, because I think they're extremely important. The only thing to remember is that we should always try and avoid creating that very fragmented day for our students where they are pulled and pushed in all sorts of direction because suddenly they need help with maths and English and history, and suddenly they're never in lessons. So I think, yes, students should be in mainstream lessons, but of course, let's give them all the support they need. And it might be that for an hour a day, they do work with an English language specialist,
Yeah.
and they do work on something that is very purposeful and meaningful. For some students, I do agree that they might need help with that sort of survival English. But as far as possible, we should always link mainstream lessons and those language support lessons.
Mhm.
And it might look like a lot of work to start with, but I think if we put a lot of hard work at the very beginning, it will pay dividends later on. So, for example, even if a student is new to English, and we think that being in a mainstream lesson, for example, when they are discussing the French Revolution,
Yeah.
might be a little bit too much. We might try and preempt and work on the French Revolution in a one-to-one session, but it still links to what is being studied in the mainstream lesson. So we might look at texts and focus on a particular grammatical structure like past tense, but it needs to be meaningful rather than just something that is not connected to what's happening
Yeah.
to the student later on. When they
Yeah.
then go back to the lessons, they actually have the vocabulary, have the grammatical structures to engage with the lesson. But at the same time, as I mentioned, some survival English might be helpful as well, particularly if students are sort of at the beginning of their journey in terms of learning the
Yeah.
basic literacy skills as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we often saw that, which was actually basic literacy in their home language was not proficient enough for
Mhm.
us to believe that actually language acquisition would be quick and easy.
Mhm.
But to go back to the question, the teachers have to be skilled. And I worry that teachers are often thrown in with lots of students with English as an additional language and multilingual learners and don't have those skills. So what is it that a teacher can do to prepare for this kind of teaching?
In teacher standards, it clearly says that teachers are responsible for adapting their teaching and learning and ensuring that those students with English as an additional language thrive in their lessons.
Mm,
But very often, and it's anecdotal, but also speaking to quite a few teachers, they very often tell me that they don't feel confident supporting multilingual learners, particularly if students arrive later on in Key Stage 4, or if students are new to English or at the early stages of acquiring the language skills, and suddenly there's that academic pressure for them to perform. How do we support them? So the support that we create obviously is multifaceted, and we wouldn't expect spectacular results from day one.
yeah,
We need to ensure that we understand that language development is a process. It's not a linear process. It's a quite complex and lengthy one. So I think always the first thing I say, one step at a time. But when we take that one step at a time, we develop. We develop as staff, but also then individual teachers will need to find how they teach the content and language at the same time.
yeah.
I think a lot of teachers still sort of, and it's right, it should be content driven. Our lessons should be content driven, but the language that we have to introduce to students mustn't be left for later,
Yeah.
or it's not an afterthought, it's not something that is add-on. So I always prompt teachers to have a look both at content and language at the same time. In my school we offer once a week meeting which happens once a week, where I work with subject teachers, and we meet together and we have a look sort of in a very minute details, very granular details at lessons and unit, and we preempt a lot of things. We are very proactive rather than just waiting for a particular lesson to arrive and suddenly, oh, I need to teach them how to compare and contrast. I've introduced content, but they still cannot compare and contrast particular
Right.
things. So it needs to be integrated, and it needs to happen from the very, very beginning. Obviously, any CPD sessions, any training is always very, very useful. Depending on the teachers that you work with, it might be just introducing the principles of learning a second language and what it's like to support multilingual learners in mainstream classes. But that blanket approach to training is not always the most effective. So I think it's focusing on how you support multilingual learners in science versus in history, what's the
Mm.
same, what's different, and how it looks in your subject.
That disciplinary literacy, I suppose, is so important. And I often found as a kind of literacy coordinator who worked in schools with high populations of EAL students, is that people tended to conflate the two. Um, and I'm trying to find the distinctions really, because it sounds like what we're saying is that good literacy teaching is good EAL teaching. But are there specialist elements of EAL teaching that we possibly need to consider?
As you've mentioned, I think there are many overlapping elements:
Mm,
good literacy teaching, and then good and effective teaching for multilingual learners. Um, but there are some distinct features as well that we need to remember about. I think when we talk about literacy, we assume that literacy is sort of delivered to students who are monolingual
right.
mainly. And those things that are very similar is, for example, the basic things. Both multilingual learners and monolingual learners need to be aware of the phonics, and they need that phonemic awareness to be able to read. When we talk about reading, both groups need to be aware how to make sure that they understand the text, so that reading comprehension. If we talk about writing, whether you're multilingual or monolingual learner, you need to know how to convey meaning in writing so it's cohesive, so there's clarity, so there's the right organization.
Yeah.
But some of the things that I think distinguish the literacy support and also multilingual support is the English language proficiency levels,
Right.
because if we talk about literacy and monolingual learners, then we assume the students are fluent
Mm.
and they understand the language. Whereas in terms of multilingual learners, we need to take into account the different levels of English proficiency and how we then adjust and modify the instruction to ensure that the students understand what is being taught in lessons. Additionally, things like ensuring that first languages are used,
Yeah.
because actually a student might be new to English, but they could have really high literacy levels in their first language, for
Yeah.
example, Arabic, and it will look different than in English.
Yeah.
It is the same script, and some of the skills might be transferable in a sort of easier fashion. So
Yeah.
if we're talking about a French speaker or Polish speaker, the system, the punctuation system is very much similar, and they
Yeah.
probably don't need to be taught as explicitly how to use
Mhm.
punctuation correctly. But in terms of other languages using different scripts, that's something that we might
Yeah.
to consider.
Yeah.
And
And even in Spanish, the idea
absolutely.
of Spanish punctuation, which is unfamiliar in kind of a European context.
Mhm.
And I wonder actually how much time teachers spend thinking about those really small things actually. We think about the words, we think about sentence level work or text level work, down to the kind of the real minutiae of
Yes, yes.
grammatical stuff.
So, for example, in Polish and in other languages, we don't use articles. So
Yeah,
we wouldn't say a dog or the dog. It's
yeah,
just dog.
yeah,
And I would consider myself an advanced bilingual learner, but I
yeah,
still make those mistakes. Although
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
aware, I've got that level of
yeah,
meta linguistic skills, and I know that this is something that I don't apply necessarily very consistently.
yeah,
Um, but those small things, obviously we don't expect teachers to be suddenly linguists,
yeah,
but analyzing students work and noticing those things.
yeah,
Why does the student doesn't use articles? Well, because in their first language they don't have any articles.
yeah.
And it's just two
But
languages
that is
working
the thing,
together.
is it noticing?
Yes.
I think that's a key thing, the ability to notice. And I will make a generalization here, and it's a sorry generalization, but your English teachers and your MFL teachers might spot that. But if you teach a subject in which looking at the technicalities of grammar is not your daily work, how do we upskill teachers in that sense to be that analytical about it?
I'm so glad you've mentioned it, because I've worked closely with the maths department as well.
Yeah,
And actually, recently we took a look at some assessment, and rightly so, the teacher focused mainly on the answers. So he looked at maths,
mhm,
whereas I looked at the language. And that's when we realized that actually we look for different things and at different things, because the students was given a point for the correct answer and wrote a very short explanation.
yeah,
But then when I pointed out, take a look at the language they used. I know the meaning is there,
yeah,
but is it correct in terms, is it appropriate to use that sort of language? um, and then we came to the realization that actually, as much as supporting them in math, we need to support them with the language development as well, because later on in life, even if they are great mathematicians and they apply for a job, um, if they make those sort of mistakes,
mm.
it might work against them. And it's collaboration. That's something that is crucial in schools.
That's another really nice tip. The idea that someone looks at the answers through the lens of the content, the subject, and another person looks at the language response in that subject. That's a really nice little observation, a paired observation that can happen.
Absolutely. And I think later on, even maths teachers, because very often that there isn't a lot of writing in maths, or there isn't a lot of reading. That doesn't mean that there isn't any literacy at all. But I think even those small interactions, and like you said, noticing
Yeah.
things. I've noticed that the maths department is getting so much better at actually pulling those language elements out and making sure that certain grammatical points are taught quite explicitly
Yeah.
to
That,
multilingual
that's
learners.
powerful. That's really
Mhm.
powerful.
Also,
And sorry, go on.
I was just about mention also that in terms of supporting multilingual learners, we also need to remember that students come from different backgrounds. Obviously, having that cultural sensitivity, that's very important as well, which is different or slightly different than just general literacy. Students might have quite high level of literacy in their first languages, but for example, the way the genres are constructed in their first language might be
Yeah.
a little bit different than what we use in English.
Absolutely. I remember a student also that speaking about kind of the masking of, you know, and the literacies in home languages. One student I had who was a Spanish speaker, very early acquisition English. A lot of her difficulties were attributed to the fact that she hadn't acquired English. But I wasn't an expert in Spanish, and so I couldn't see the literacy difficulty she was having with Spanish. But
Mhm.
it was only when we had someone come in and say, actually, let's have an assessment of this, we realized that language was really masking a send need.
Mhm.
And that's not always the case. Obviously, it's 99% not the case. But that conflation of EAL and send still exists, I think.
Unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, it does still exist.
Mm.
And I know in a lot of schools, Senkos are sort of overseeing the EL provision,
Yeah,
which is okay as long as we don't assume that EAL and S students with EAL and SEN are the
mm,
same, because they are not. They are not. But interestingly, you mentioned actually checking first languages and the literacy in first languages. It is so important, I think.
mm,
Um, in my school, we have over 50 different languages used
right.
by students and dialects, and we have some teachers who speak those
Yeah,
languages, but obviously not all of them. But what we do when we have new students joining us, we do ask them actually to write in their first languages if they
yeah,
are literate, and they are always extremely happy and proud
yeah,
to do
yeah,
that. And later on, it's just observations. So even though I don't speak other languages, loads of other languages, even observing, for example, how quickly the students write,
yeah, yeah,
how do they form the letters, are they able to self-correct, and even asking them to read things out loud. And again, the prosody, the fluency of reading in that first language, I think that gives us a lot of insight into the
yeah.
levels.
Absolutely, absolutely. And these are things that don't require specialist skills as such. This is just observation and reading and writing, isn't it? And
Absolutely, yes.
we can all do that. I'm mindful to talk about the curriculum because the curriculum isn't necessarily set up to support students who are multilingual. Is there a way of creating a curriculum that supports EAL students?
Well, EAL students are students who are supposed to access the mainstream curriculum.
Yeah,
That's that's the distinctiveness of students with EAL. So these are students who are not learning English because they are going abroad for a week in the
yeah,
sunshine. These are the students who should be able to access a challenging and supportive curriculum.
yeah,
So there isn't a separate EAL curriculum, but obviously we can create our own curriculum that supports EAL
yeah,
learners.
yeah, yeah.
And first of all, it could start with the topics
Mm,
and the text we read and who is represented in our curriculum. Obviously, there is a certain level of flexibility within that,
yeah.
um, but it's so powerful to see students' realities reflected
Mm,
in the lessons they attend,
mm,
whether it's choosing a text that reflects their own realities and they can see themselves in the text, whether it's introducing a historical figure or a historical event. It is extremely powerful.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but
And I like that idea. I mean, I'm a strong advocate of reflecting students' identities. I talk about that quite a lot, but um, again, I'm not sure how much people would consider that, how important it is for students who come from different places, kind of global citizens, to be able to see the globe, in the place that they're now in. You know, that's an aspect of EAL teaching that I don't think is considered. Um, and I can think of some really good examples actually of texts that reflect the reality of those students.
that, for example, in my school, the English department is teaching Purple Hibiscus
Yeah,
by Amanda Ngozi Adichie, and we have quite a big population of Nigerian students.
yeah,
And when during admissions meetings, for example, a few times I mentioned actually this is the text that year nines are studying. Um, it's just the transformation on people's faces.
yeah,
And mother says, "Oh, we are Igbo people as well." And I read the book, and later in lessons, actually the teachers can say, can you explain a little bit more, because you know more than I do, because
yeah,
this is your culture, this is your tradition. And seeing how students feel empowered,
yeah.
how proud they are. We also study I am Malala in English, and
Right.
we have a lot of students who speak Urdu. They're
Yeah,
able to read the words, they're
yeah,
able to explain certain nuances.
yeah.
It's absolutely fabulous. It's absolutely
Yeah,
fabulous.
I've taught I'm Malala. Oh my goodness, that was a life-changing experience. And the population of Muslim students in my
Mhm.
lesson just lit up with debate and discussion. And I had students contributing that hadn't contributed before, and it was
Exactly.
really lovely.
Wonderful.
Um,
And it's so
and I
important
guess
to,
what I meant, sorry, go on.
I was just about to say, it's so also important to extend it beyond the curriculum, because once we've read I Am Malala, we had so many students coming to the library and they wanted to read other books
Yeah,
and find out more about Malala, but also other people as well. And it's just extending students' views and perspectives, and ensuring that the libraries are really well stocked. And again, those mirrors, windows, and doors,
yeah,
it's so crucial.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Absolutely. And I guess what I meant by the curriculum is this sense that, like you said, this idea of deliberately making choices to include, so it's not that there is a curriculum specifically designed to teach EAL learners, but that sense of welcome, that sense of acceptance, that sense of comfort, and belonging that happens when we
Mhm.
choose a curriculum that allows that connection with a home language, a home identity is so important.
And students come to us with so much experience anyway. One of the researchers, I think Gonzalez, uses the term funds of knowledge. They have those funds of knowledge that they can share. And even if, for example, we study Romeo and Juliet and the student is new to English, they might not be able to understand every single word and might not be able to understand every single sentence,
Mm.
but understanding the relationships between people, and I'm certain they've experienced relationship in their own lives, in their own cultures and traditions, and there will be similar texts that they've read. So
Yeah,
that there's always that point of when they can connect, and then sort of creating those ways of connecting to the curriculum. Um,
yeah.
it's
No,
very powerful.
I'm now just thinking about the amount of times I've heard people say, "Oh, I've got lots of EAL learners. We shouldn't be studying Shakespeare with them." And I often think, but it's a text in performance, and a sound, tone, the prosody, the
Mhm.
flow. You can get nuance from that if you have a skilled teacher who is able to do
Mhm.
that. Um, do your EAL students study Shakespeare?
Yes, yes, they all do. They all do. And it's always that balance
Mm,
between being challenging.
yeah,
So it is a challenging text. Any text by Shakespeare is challenging, but also just as we challenge them, we support them. And I think this is very important. So it's never you are in lessons, you're going to study Shakespeare,
mm,
you are here, we are going to help you, we are going to support you. And we have all the scaffolding and all the techniques and strategies in place, including explicit vocabulary instruction, all the scaffolding, linguistic scaffolding, because there's the sort of, we could distinguish between content,
mm.
scaffolding content, but also scaffolding the language and
Yeah,
ensuring that students can access the lesson. Because just because the lesson is available, because we know that students being in mainstream lesson is the best approach, um, the availability of the curriculum is not the same as the curriculum being accessible. So we
yeah,
mustn't
yeah.
conflate these two things,
Mm.
because students are in lessons, they are learning. Well, let's have a look at the support you give them so they can access and understand the lesson, both content-wise and language-wise.
Yeah. That's
So
a really good point. The availability of the lesson, the content is not the same as the accessibility of the content. That's a powerful thing to remember, I think, as teachers. Just moving us on slightly, I am conscious that, with time, we can do so much. But when there is very little time and the stakes are high, you have EAL learners, perhaps who are at early acquisition stage, um, coming in at key stage 4. What advice do you have for teachers who find themselves in that situation?
yes, Key Stage 4 students arriving late. One thing we need to remember that multilingual learners are not a homogeneous group. So
Mm,
just because we have a student who is an EL learner, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are new to English or new to education. It's very important that we establish and focus on the previous educational experiences. How much background knowledge do they have in terms of education generally, but in topics that we are going to study? And
yeah,
it's always very difficult. I think the most disheartening thing is when we have students who arrive in Key Stage 4 and it's difficult to find an option for them because, oh, but we are halfway through doing this and they cannot join, or it's difficult now, what about this option? That's one of the most disheartening things, and I would hope that every single teacher welcomes students like this with open arms. And again, I'm not saying that teachers are terrible, it's just, are they prepared? Do
yeah,
they have enough skills? This is what I'm talking about, that teachers are sometimes reluctant to accept a student, maybe to take them into their lessons just because they don't feel supported enough. And I would love for every single content teacher to be able to say, I know it's December, I know it's year 11, but I have enough confidence in myself and enough expertise and support from everybody else in the school to be
yeah,
able to support the students in my lesson. I
yeah,
mean, of course, there is that academic pressure if
yeah,
they are in Key Stage 4, and it's both that academic pressure is on teachers because they have a new student, they need results. There's the pressure on the student themselves as well. If they move from a different country, that phase of sort of making sure that they adapt to not only the new culture but also the new educational settings, which might be completely different. Never mind learning academic language and academic content. It's like, as I mentioned, these are not just conversations about the weather and how
mm,
you're doing. These are very deep, complex conversations and concepts they have to learn. My advice would be flexible,
mm.
be open-minded. The last thing you want to do is sort of isolate the student
Yeah,
and
yeah,
start saying that this student needs to be with a support staff because they
yeah,
cannot access Macbeth. It's too difficult.
mm,
And suddenly there's a topic coming up in science that is deemed too difficult for the student to access, and suddenly they are withdrawn from science. Well, what about then, history or maths?
mm,
Um, we have to be honest with ourselves. Some things might not be realistic, and maybe if a student is new to English,
yeah,
it might not be realistic for that particular student to sit a GCSE exam and
yeah,
secure a grade, a pass grade. But
mm,
at the same time, I've never seen a student who arrived and said, I'm not bothered, I don't want to do it,
Yeah, yeah,
They want to do it. They want to be part of the group. They want to be included, and it's for us teachers to ensure that they feel part of that group. And
mm,
GCSE grade might not be for them achievable for them yet, and it's not attainable at this stage. But we need to ensure that the students are exposed to academic content, and we are sort of paving the path for them
mm,
to a
lovely.
future success. So it might, you might think, well, what's the point of the students sitting
Yeah,
mock exams? They're not going to pass. It's too late. It's a difficult decision to take, but I would say, but how about we explain to them what happens? This is the experience that every single year 11 student
yeah,
has. Maybe they actually do want to sit that mock exam.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
they are teenagers. They understand that they might not be able to pass, but let's have that honest and frank conversation.
yeah.
But it will prepare them for later on in their lives when maybe in 2 years they will be ready to sit that exam.
And they will have experienced the process.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's
And
so
also,
much, there's so much complexity around it, isn't there?
let's remember that students' English proficiency levels are not indicative of their cognitive ability. So
Yes.
students might be new to English, but actually they might have excelled in education in
Yeah,
their own home countries. And they have that maturity to be able to handle certain topics. If they're not in English, if they're literate in their first languages, let's expose them to those topics and concepts in their first language.
yeah. I mean, you talked a little bit there about conflating EAL with low cognitive ability. What other kind of common pitfalls are there, common traps that teachers fall into when it comes to EAL students?
I think we've mentioned some of them already. So
Yeah,
one of
yeah,
them is obviously conflating the language proficiency level with the ability to
yeah.
engage with academic content. The second one I've mentioned also is assuming that EAL learners are a very homogeneous group, which is not true, not true at all. We've also mentioned SEN and EAL.
Mm,
Again, sometimes it is still conflated. Um, Also, I think it's important to focus on cultural differences,
yeah,
particularly with the new students. Um, we mustn't expect them to try to fit in. I think it's always very powerful to acknowledge their own culture, their own traditions,
yeah.
and make sure that we expose them to what happens in our schools, but
Mm,
we are doing it in a very sensitive way. One of the other things I also would mention, and research proves that acquiring language or learning a new language is a
yeah,
process, and I've mentioned that already. And it goes back to, I think, 1980s when Jean Cummins introduced something called BICS and CALP. So
right,
he distinguished between basic English ability to sort of use language,
right,
um, but also then he talks about cognitive academic language proficiency.
right,
So BICS is that basic interpersonal ability to use language,
right.
and it develops usually within 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
Whereas the ability to use academic language at the same level as monolingual learners takes about 5 to 7 years.
Um,
And that's something that is very often conflated, because a student who has been in the country for maybe 2 or 3 years
yeah.
comes across as quite fluent and confident in terms of using particularly their oral language and conversational language.
What we call playground speak.
Yes, absolutely. But then when you actually look mainly at the written work produced maybe during exams or
Yeah,
completely independent tasks, there is sort of mismatch.
yeah,
And then very often there's confusion. Well, what's happening? I think maybe are they SEN? Students with
yeah.
SEN? Do they need
Or are
more
they not
help?
trying?
Are they not trying?
Yeah,
And actually, it's it's been proven that it takes years to actually achieve that cognitive academic language proficiency. Now, this is not to say that basic interpersonal
mm,
communication skills are not important, because they
yeah,
are, because they, again, they create that entry point for students to access lessons. So we need to just be aware about that distinction, but it's not either or, it's and.
Yeah.
This type of language and this type of language is very, very important. And that's why it's so crucial that every single teacher develops language all the time.
Yeah.
That they don't just stop, okay, you've
It's a
been here for
fundamental. Yeah.
absolutely 2 to 3 years, you should be able to write complex sentences and produce different genres. It needs to still be addressed on a,
Yeah.
continuously in lessons.
Um,
Also, I would say, sorry, it's just, I was also,
yeah, no, I'm interested. Go on.
also, yes, we've mentioned that students will be learning in English and through English, and the exams will be in English. But the importance of making sure that the first languages are not only preserved, but they are expanded, they are developed, and very much included in students' lives. We talk about how great it is to be multilingual, and as parents, we probably send students to extra language
Yeah.
lessons, and we would pay loads of money for our children to be able to speak another language. But somehow we don't have the same approach when we have a multilingual learner and they already speak 2 or 3 other languages. We focus on English. So I think it's just making sure that we know and that our students know that we do value their languages they speak, and we want them to develop and carry on. Um,
Absolutely.
it's extremely powerful,
Yeah.
extremely powerful.
I am I am really conscious that we've managed to talk for 45 minutes and we haven't mentioned the fact that you've written a book about this. So, can you tell us about the book?
So the book was published a couple of weeks ago, and the seed for the book was essentially ensuring that every single teacher
Mm,
feels supported and empowered to help multilingual learners. And 20% of our students in English schools are classed as multilingual learners. So that's a huge cohort of students. And I've worked with students who use English as an additional language for quite a few years now. And whenever I speak to teachers, whenever I connect with them, they always say, "What can I do? What shall I do?
yeah,
What is powerful? What is effective?" So the book is essentially a very practical resource for teachers to access. There is a little bit of theory about language acquisition and language learning, which I find fascinating. And I think teachers should know and
yeah,
have that foundational understanding of how language is developed, first languages, but all and second languages. But the book offers a lot of practical strategies, which are extremely versatile. And what they are very much content based and
right,
subject based. There are a lot of examples, step by step examples of how to implement certain approaches, and I've given a lot of variety of those examples,
yeah,
and they can be used in loads of different languages. The main message I think of the book is that things will not happen overnight.
right.
So as a teacher, please be patient with yourself. You're not there to teach, English
Species.
language, yeah, like
Yeah.
in crash course in 2 weeks. But also, please be patient with your students, acknowledge their strengths, and work together as a team.
Yeah. And it would be really helpful if you gave everybody the title.
It's empower. Oh gosh, it's a very
I
long
love that.
title.
You wrote it, but it's hard to remember the title.
It's empowering EL learners in secondary schools.
And that is by Joanna Kolota. And it is available now. It's, if we'd done this interview 2, 3 weeks ago, it would have
It
been a
is.
different world. It wouldn't have existed. But no, I think for us, as learners, as teacher learners, being able to kind of have a resource like that is particularly useful because we don't always get taught the ideas around language acquisition or language development, and to be able to have a handy resource that's actually been written quite recently, because I think some of the texts around EAL were written quite a long time ago.
Mhm.
And so to have something new is really, really powerful.
And
Um,
I hope also that the book gives the examples that it's not about producing extra resources or changing a lot of things, but being very ambitious for all multilingual learners in your classrooms, and making sure that you amplify the language, you
Mm-mm.
help them achieve what everybody else in your class can achieve.
Yeah.
So it's not sort of a ready-made resource that you can just, it's not a worksheet, it's
Mm.
not printing worksheets, it's just how you can adapt your teaching to ensure that multilingual learners thrive in your lessons.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
hope it's useful, and gives a lot of sort of ideas how to teach skills. And although it's divided into chapters based loosely on skills, I think it provides a very comprehensive tool
yeah.
um, that
And
teachers
your
can apply.
experience in your school, kind of doing the work on the ground, if you like, is central to this as well. You see, it's
It
not
is,
from a
yeah.
theoretical perspective, it's coming from a practical.
So it's trialed and tested,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
the
and you've seen success
examples.
with it. You know? I have just thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. That is one of the fastest interviews. That feels like it's gone so quickly, and my mind is buzzing now, with what I should have done as a teacher, and if I ever step back into the classroom, what I could do. But just really grateful to you for you sharing your expertise with us. And I hope that our audience have really kind of gained an insight into not only the complexity but the joy. Um,
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, that's absolutely. It's one of the most rewarding experiences, working with multilingual learners.
Yeah, I can
Absolutely
see it. I can
wonderful.
see it on your face. We are going to stop there, but thank you so much for joining
Thank
us,
you very much. Thank
and
you.
hopefully talk to you soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.